Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Fairfax. We hope you enjoy this sermon from a recent Sunday worship service.
I've been thinking a lot this week about perspective, about one thinks who comes from a vastly different perspective than I do about what's happening right now in the country. I don't have too far to think because I have family and some friends who feel very differently about the state of the country now than I do. Which also makes me wonder about the various ways that we might be feeling this in the congregation. After all, in theory, we're pretty aligned in our principles and values about the world, but no gathering of this size is ever totally aligned with whether politically left, center, or right. And while wondering about this, I thought about the continuums that I frequently cite as examples of where we as humans fall when discussing any subject. For example, let's take football, for instance. I know that there are some pretty rabid football fans in this room today, and frankly, I also know there are some of us who don't care about football at all, or who's playing, or any of the teams that currently might be playing each other later today, for which there are actually some pretty rabid fans from both teams right here, right now. This is not the subject of the sermon. Obviously, I'm just trying to use this as an example that we all can feel very different about very many things, even in this room and online. If any of you haven't heard, feeling different about this country, about the message of this faith, about what expressions of mercy and love might mean, they were on display this week at the National Prayer Service at the National Cathedral. Episcopal Bishop Reverend Marianne Edgar Buddy said this: "Let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you, and as you told the nation yesterday, you have felt the providential hand of a loving God. In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives. The people who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry farms and meatpacking plants, who wash the dishes after we eat at restaurants and work night shifts in hospitals. They may not be citizens or have the proper documentation, but the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals. They pay taxes and are good neighbors. They are faithful members of our churches, mosques, synagogues, gurdwara, and temples. I ask you, Mr. President, to have mercy on those in our communities whose children fear their parents will be taken away, and that you help those who are fleeing war zones and persecution in their own lands to find compassion and welcome here." And then she said, "Our God teaches us that we are to be merciful to the stranger, for we all once were strangers in this land. May God grant us the strength and courage to honor dignity of every human being, to speak the truth to one another in love, and walk humbly with each other and our God for the good of all people, for the good of all people in this nation and in the world. Amen." Perspective is really an amazing thing. This country was never built on a complete unity of thought. In fact, the country in part was built on how diversity of thought could be designed in such a way that we could maybe hear each other's perspective and then make the best decision for all people while protecting the rights of the minority. I know that some people's perspective wouldn't be that it wasn't designed that way at all, and others might think that it was and has never fully lived up to it. Again, the point is on display this week in the nation's capital there was a pretty clear demonstration of how different our perspectives can be in this country. We can have differing perspectives. We can have discussions, we can have debates, we can have vastly different thoughts. I understand that people have different views on the role of the federal government. I understand that people have different views here and online, vastly different views about religion. I get that there are some issues that we may never agree on. But as a practicing Unitarian Universalist, not just as a minister, but someone who tries to live by our principles, our values, and the evolving history and theology of our tradition, I personally am deeply struggling with the policies, plans, and actions that have come from the perspectives of those now in charge down the road east from here. That seem so fueled from perspectives of cruelty, disregard for human dignity, and authoritarian impulses. So let me be clear. We certainly may have different political values. We certainly may not agree on some issues. We certainly could have different perspectives on religion. But my perspective, and I get to say it from up here, on Unitarian Universalism tells me that this administration is now undertaking things that are not being merciful to the stranger, not honoring the dignity of every human being, not speaking truth to one another in love, and is not walking humbly with each other and or God for the good of all people. Now, with all this said, I know that all of us here today may be feeling this on various places of the continuum. And with that understanding, there are some fears I feel I must name. Some here are afraid of losing their jobs or have already lost them. Some here are terrified of what has been unleashed for those in the LGBTQ community. Some have been asked in some dystopian version of fidelity to the new administration to tell on their co-workers whose only perceived sin was to be hired for the purpose of bringing fairness and equity to systems that were designed to be biased since their inception. And although some may not be directly impacted by any of this, it sure feels like in one way or another, we are all carrying this around. You don't have to be thinking about it every second of every day to feel it in your body. It can and does often just live under the surface as a general sense of anxiety or sadness or grief or whatever. I know that if I go to Wegmans and I see any of you there and say, "Hi, how are you?" most people will say, "Good," and then move on to express concern over all the chocolate cake in my shopping cart. But I have to tell you, I know that there's more there than meets the ears. I know this because in every committee check-in this week, in so many conversations and comments online this week, it's obvious we are carrying this weight around with us like a rucksack. A rucksack whose weight we are carrying that is actually filled with trauma. For some in this congregation and certainly beyond, what is happening in this country is deeply distressing or disturbing experience that at times can overwhelm our coping mechanisms and cause significant emotional, psychological, and sometimes physical distress. And honestly, from what I've seen this week, I don't think I'm being overly dramatic. Which leads me to one of the main messages of today, which is that we are in a time where we need to listen to each other, hear each other, and love each other. There are people here who are feeling deep pain and unease, And wherever we fall in the continuum of perceptions about what's happening in this country, please be aware that people right here and in so many other places in this country are deeply struggling. And our support and kindness for each other is as necessary now as ever before. Now, actually, today, I was going to preach about generational trauma based on a workshop I once did with Resmaa Menakem, the author of My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Mending of Our Bodies and Hearts, which I will do at some other time. But today, I do want to note a few of his words when he writes, "Years as a healer and a trauma therapist have taught me that trauma isn't destiny. The body, not the thinking brain, is where we experience most of our pain, pleasure, and joy, and where we process most of what happens to us. It's also where we do most of our healing, including our emotional and psychological healing, and it's where we experience resilience and a sense of flow. The stereotype of UUs is that we live up here and not as much down here. But I don't buy that anymore. We may not always be aware of it, but whether it's the tears welling up in our eyes or the tight shoulders that we walk around with or the exhaustion that we feel, I know that we're carrying all this weight with us. And remember, Resmaa also said, and it is where we experience resilience and a sense of flow. So as much as I encourage you to go for more walks when the weather permits, or talk with friends, or make yourself a nice cup of tea, or listen to your favorite music more often, or cook a good meal, or any of those things and more, I want to do one more thing, and I want to encourage you to come here. Not to isolate yourselves. Come here and be with others if you at all can. Clap when you want to clap. I'm not going to argue about that. Sit quietly if that's what you need. Get up and move if that feels right. And my friends, eat together. There's a reason that's always mentioned in the Bible. And be here together to sing, to lift our voices in song. In fact, halftime. Let's do this one more time. Loosen, loosen, baby. You don't have to carry the weight of the world. The muscles and bones. Let go, let go, let go. One more time, please. Loosen, loosen, baby. You don't have to carry the weight of this world in your muscles and bones. Let go, let go, let go. We are in some hard times. It is unclear how this will play out, but this I know. We need to take care of ourselves and each other. And we need to take care of those who have not come here yet, but will need to. And now with all that's going on, it just confirms that this is the primary reason for this community to exist. And one last thing. Although the language may be somewhat different than her tradition, my perspective on Unitarian Universalism agrees with the basics of the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, D.C., when she said, "Our God teaches us that we are to be merciful to the stranger, for we were all strangers in this land. My God, grant us the strength and courage to honor the dignity of every human being, to speak truth to one another in love, and walk humbly with each other and our God for the good of all people, in this nation and in the world." Amen.
Thank you for listening to this sermon from the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Fairfax. To listen to more sermon podcasts, go to uucf.org/sermons and scroll down to sermon podcasts.